You are tuned to Cafe Cabaret. This is the wrong hero in one of my earthly mortal guises, and I've come to you to continue our little discussion of the 1996 presidential elections. Seeing as how we are 8 weeks into this discussion and we've barely gotten to the election itself, it's hardly what you would characterize a little discussion. However, be that as it may, as Andrew J. Glass put it in the prestigious but not very widely circulated The New Leader magazine, the presidential race is really 51 races that are being run simultaneously on parallel tracks. Now, that point has a lot going for it. So let's just talk about the logistics of this, because last week we basically took up perhaps the bulk of our presentation talking around the issue instead of directly confronting it, and that's really too bad in a way, because I could have done so much more with that time and with your time. And if you did not tune out after the first 20 minutes of dithering, God bless you, because of course last week the wrong hero did his greatest sustained monologue ever, and if you missed it, then bad cess to you. Anyway, this presentation is entitled Radical Clarity, and I certainly hope that it lives up to its billing. Well, first I guess I got to put a little thing here that indicates to the people over at, the fine people over at CCTV, exactly what it is they're getting here. And now this program is only going to run for about 1 hour and 20 minutes. I'm sorry for the necessity of doing this, but you know, things are getting kind of hectic here over at 104S, as I like to call it. So, if you'll excuse me for just a second, I think I'll go get some more coffee. If you are tuned in next week, you'll be happy to know that I was finally able to pop that pimple on my neck, but it's not getting any better. I'm still having a look at it now. Oh God, it's huge! It has, in fact, turned into a huge sebaceous cyst. The more you monkey with it, the worse it's going to get. This I know. Holy God! It's huge! It's like it's taking over my entire neck. Oh, this is just what I need. You know, this is just how you get a cyst. You play with a pimple, and, you know, you don't clean it, and you pop it, and it's horrible. Well, I'm going to do what I should have done a long time ago. I'm going to, like, you know, bathe it and put some medicine on it and hope for the best. God, I have to go to the doctor on Tuesday. He's going to say, you got this huge sebaceous cyst on your neck. You're going to have to come in so I can drain it. And it's going to cost me an extra $100 just because I wasn't smart enough not to pop a huge pimple. God. You know, there's a lot of wisdom in the old sayings. And perhaps the saying that was operative here should have been, leave well enough alone. I should have just let the thing go. I mean, it wasn't like this yesterday, before I started toying with it. Well, maybe some witch hazel will dry it up a little. again, it could simply irritate it more, constrict the blood vessels in such a way that makes it less capable of finding a favorable resolution. And it's going to sting like the devil, too. Oh, man, I wish to God I had just left it alone. You know, I mean, it's very unsanitary. It's covered with dirt. You're poking and prodding at it and squeezing it and, you know, just causing it to spread. And now it's huge. It's enormous. It's like this gigantic silver dollar on my neck. Oh, it's terrible. I think I'm going to put a Band-Aid on it. To keep me from compulsively touching it. That's probably what I should have done a long time ago when I first noticed it. And then, you know, that would have been, it would have gone away by itself. But no, I had to keep playing with it. I only really noticed it yesterday when I got my hair cut. Somebody was holding up a mirror for me to look at the back of my neck, and I saw this huge pimple. It looked terrible, too. It was all rubbed raw and red. Like, how long have I had this thing and didn't even notice it? It's sort of like the presidential elections in such a way that I cannot really bring myself to draw a ample parallel. I'm so upset by this cyst, or whatever the hell it is. You know, my girlfriend scoffed. She said, "That's just a pimple." Her brother has one just like it, though. See, that's what I'm dreading, that I got this huge thing. And, well, anyway, it's all dealt with now. And now that I've wasted a good 10 minutes talking about my nauseating bodily defects, gee, I'm not even sure. And another thing that upsets me is I'm not even sure which show this is supposed to be. Maybe I'm missing a show, which would be bad. I mean, I know I did Naked to Mine Enemies. I don't remember ever doing a show called Negative Capability. So there might not be a show for the 10th of June. I guess I'll find out soon enough. And if there is no show for the 10th of June, then I can probably go back in and fill it in. That's really too bad, though. I remember doing Naked to Mine Enemies. See, I haven't really been keeping very good records here. Anyhow, the presidential race is really 51 races that are being run simultaneously on parallel tracks. And so that means that it's not simply a matter of winning the plurality of votes. It's a matter of targeting the 9 or 10 states with the most electoral votes, deciding which ones could go into your column, which ones will definitely go into your column, and which ones will never go into your column, and focusing only on the ones that could go into your column. In other words, swing states. Now, the swing vote in America has only been a recent phenomenon. Of course, in England, which has a multi-party system, the swing vote is crucial, as the recent election of Tony Blair would seem to indicate. Tony Blair only won. He won with less of the votes than Neil Kinnock lost with back in whenever it was, 1989. But more Tories stayed home than Labour, and the election was on May Day, which wasn't a very good or auspicious sign for the Tories. And so Tony Blair won not because of the voters, but because of the people who didn't vote. Of course, Gore Vidal has pointed out that there are basically two parties in America, the Democrat-Republican parties and the party of people who don't vote. And voter attendance has gone down in America. It was at its lowest in this election since something like, 1840 or something like that. No, even worse, 1824, I think it was. The era of good feelings was just coming to an end. So, in England, voter attendance was also down, but you see it was down to 71%, which is unusually low for Great Britain, but which is probably unprecedentedly high for a country like the United States. I don't think there's ever been an election in which 71% of the eligible voters cast a ballot. Although, you know, I could be wrong about this. So, Andrew J. Glass says that what seems to be the greatest aphrodisiac for a powerful person is the excitement of risk. So let's keep that in mind, the excitement of risk. And of course, there was a good deal of risk to be had in the presidential election of 1996. Because, well, what if we had elected Bob Dole and he had died? Then Jack Kemp would be president. Now, I have nothing against people from Buffalo in particular, but I'm not sure Jack Kemp is really a good guy to be president. What 96 was basically a swing election. Nothing much was decided. Its major role was to set the stage for for the year 2000, just the way that the 1984 election set the stage for 1988. And of course 1988 set the stage for 1992. Now let's see just how this happened. A history of the last 20 years. Well, you had Ford, the caretaker president, who ran against a Democrat, Jimmy Carter, who let it be known that he wasn't really aligned to any major political party, but that he was nominally a Democrat. And so the nominal Democrat in a squeaker managed to defeat the unelected incumbent, whose running mate, incidentally, was Bob Dole. So Bob Dole fell on his sword in 1976. Jimmy Carter fell on his sword in 1980. See, it all sort of comes together from the vantage point of 1997. Ronald Reagan gave Gerald Ford a run for his money in 1976 and divided the Republican Party. Gerald Ford fell because of the divisions in the Republican Party. The hard right stayed home in 1976, but they came out in full force in 1980, and the hard left stayed home. And because Teddy Kennedy had split the Democratic Party in 1980, and they either stayed home or they cast their vote for John Anderson. So, and if John Anderson hadn't been in the race, who is to say that Jimmy Carter might not have actually managed to eke out a victory? I know I certainly would have voted for Jimmy Carter over Ronald Reagan in 1980 if John Anderson hadn't been in the election. So 1980 basically set the stage for the next 12 years, as we're probably all well aware. More specifically, 1984 was, in many senses, the penultimate gasp of the liberal wing of the Democratic Party. Because Walter Mondale, who of course was very popular with the unions, lost devastatingly, in just the same way that Goldwater lost devastatingly to Lyndon Johnson in 1964. So you see these things run in 20-year cycles. Let's go all the way back to 1964. The hard right takes over the Republican Party, is utterly vanquished by a centrist Democrat. In 1968, the left wing of the Democratic Party, the Democratic Party goes a little to the left, and the Republican Party goes a little towards the center and the right with Richard Nixon. It's always the centrist party that seems to overcome. And in 1968, Richard Nixon barely managed to win, but when he did, and in 1972, the Democrats put up somebody much further to the left than Hubert Humphrey, and lost. Now, to the centrist candidate. In 1976, both of the candidates were basically centrist. However, because of the excesses of Richard Nixon, um, Gerald Ford was more or less tarred with the same brush and lost to Jimmy Carter, who was a little to the left of center. Well, after 4 years of Jimmy Carter, people were tired of a government that governed from the left of center. So they picked somebody who governed somewhat from the right of center. Still, as it turns out, Ronald Reagan was something of a centrist rather than a hard right-winger. But it was the ghost of 1964 which elected Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan had enough committed Republicans willing to work hard to see that he was presented in the best possible light that he would, in fact, be elected. And then, in 1984, we picked Walter Mondale, who was very much to the left of center, and he was defeated by the somewhat more centrist Ronald Reagan. And then in 1988, we had George Bush, and nobody knew what he believed in, but he was Reagan's running mate, and some of that rubbed off on him. Just as Gerald Ford failed to benefit from Richard Nixon's reputation, so George Bush managed to benefit from Ronald Reagan's reputation and defeat an unusually weak and unusually left of center Democratic nominee, none other than our own former governor, Mike Dukakis. Well, the Democrats learned their lesson in 1992. The Republicans, however, failed to learn the lessons of 1976. George Bush was tarnished with his reputation as basically a promise-breaking and do-nothing president. And the financial situation in the country was not entirely auspicious. Alan Greenspan didn't have quite the glow of accomplishment that he now presently seems to have. And you can tell who's in and who's out by the sheer amount of coverage that they get in the national press, especially the news weeklies and opinion monthlies. And Greenspan is definitely very much in. Dick Morris, strangely enough, even after his catastrophic disgrace, is still in. He still gets a lot of citations, and a lot of these opinion monthlies and weeklies quote him at length concerning the Clinton administration. And even the National Enquirer has a lengthy so-called expose of the inner workings of the Clinton White House. Let me quote from memory from this prestigious weekly. Yes, Bill Clinton is endlessly horny. He had sex with Sharon Stone. Hillary Clinton had an affair with Vince Foster. All this is from the horse's mouth. Dick Morris, his own self, as he told to his second wife, or his wife on the side. So Dick Morris can add bigamy to his curricula vitae as well, since apparently not only did he have several prostitutes on a string, but also a virtual second wife that his first wife didn't know about, his real wife didn't know about. Anyway, you can see how every presidential election sets the stage for the one that comes after it, and perhaps for the next 2 or 3 presidential elections. You can also see that the party in power either fails to move to the center and loses, or manages to create the impression of moving to the center and wins, and also that the party which fails to learn from its mistakes inevitably loses. So what we had is the 1992 election. It was a 3-way race, of course, and if anything, Perot probably drew more votes from Bush than he did from Clinton, and Clinton managed to win with perhaps one of the lowest margins of victory since, I don't know, for some time. Let's see, I guess since 1916 or so, or 1912 actually. So you recall, in 1912, Taft, the Republican incumbent, was running against Woodrow Wilson, the Democratic challenger, but Taft's party was split in two by the the Bull Moose Party with the former President Teddy Roosevelt, who got more votes than the Republican, splitting the Republican Party in two, enabling Woodrow Wilson to become president. Now, what if Teddy Roosevelt had become president? Chances are we would have gone to war that much sooner than we did. We would have gotten involved in World War I in 1914 instead of 1916. If Taft had been president, pressures from his right wing of his Republican Party probably would have forced him into the war much sooner than we actually got involved in it. It might have been beneficial to us, actually. We would have been more prepared for war and more able to prevent the communist revolution. Hello? Hi. Oh, not too bad. Well, she's at a meeting. But I have a feeling that I'm probably not even going to go for the interview. It's only 15 hours a week. There's no benefits. It is in Newport. It conflicts with both my jobs. Mondays, 1 through 5. Wednesdays, 5 to 9. Alternating Fridays and Saturdays, 9 to 5, 10 to 6. Yes, I'm going to, build bridges. I'm going to let her know that currently, whereas ordinarily, I'll rehearse it with you. Ordinarily, I might have been very interested in this job. I am still very interested in working at the Newport Public Library. However, at this time, I'm working 2 part-time jobs, going to graduate school, and I have a stipend as a graduate assistant. And so it would be difficult for me at this time to fit this position into my schedule, but I very much appreciate your thinking of me, and I think perhaps what I should do is send you an updated resume that you can put on in your files for such a time as you may have a position opening. I could almost do this, but I'd have to quit at the end of 3 months, which wouldn't be right. So, yeah, so that's good news, though, that, she even bothered to contact me for this. No, I've never, last time we were in Newport, I don't think we even went in there. I sent a resume out with all those resumes last year at this time. Well, yeah, of course. Yes. All right. Then, at least I have a name now, and I can contact her. Okay, that's good. I'll work that in too. So I'll try to reach her sometime in the afternoon, maybe around 2 o'clock or something. We do. I will. Okay. You don't have to go to the market because I'll pick up some hamburgers. All right? You want me to get some rolls? Okay. Will do. Love you, Angel. Good. Can't wait to see you. But I will be a little late for getting back from work. Because I have to go out not through the Eaton and River Street gates. I have to go all the way across campus. So. No, I'll slow me down 7 minutes. I'll probably be back at about 7:45. All right? See you then. Bye-bye. Well, so, yes, my busy life. I'm sure you're fascinated by every aspect of it. to the same degree that I am. However, where were we? Oh yeah, I'm still digressing like mad. You know, I'm not really getting much done here. Uh, I mean, I've got an awful lot of material to go through, and now I can see where people who teach have difficulty getting through their entire lesson plan during the time. You got to like allow twice as much time. I thought this was going to be a 10-week thing, but no. I mean, this is already week number 8, and I've barely gotten through 1/5 of it. Now I know it's not going to run for 40 weeks. I hope I'll probably finish this by the end of summer. You know, by the middle of September, or in a worst case scenario, the middle of October. I have it running until September 23rd, by which point we will have more new Wrong Hero performances instead of lectures. So, anyway, let's have a little bit of an election rundown here. Well, you know, there's always been a scandal. Where was I, though? First we were talking about, oh yeah. Okay, to sum up then, the party that moves to the center in a presidential election wins. The party that fails to learn from its mistakes from the last 2 or 3 election cycles loses. It's as simple as that, my friends. Whenever there's a third party involved, the incumbent is in great danger, grave danger. Of course, if there's a 4th party, or even a 5th party, then that changes the electoral calculus in such a degree, that the incumbent is not necessarily in danger. Let's look at 1912, the third party challenge, and the incumbent loses. Let's look at 1924, Robert La Follette does very well. However, he is in fact getting all of his votes at the expense of the challenger rather than the incumbent, Calvin Coolidge. Calvin Coolidge wins handily against John W. Davis, I believe it was, surely one of our most obscure Democratic nominees for president, and Robert La Follette. And of course, Roosevelt had a minor third-party challenge in 1936, but nothing he couldn't deal with, and easily defeated Robert Landon. Alf Landon. In fact, if anything, more votes were taken from Alf Landon because he was running slightly to the right of center, and the third-party challenge was from the right. In 1948, Harry Truman's Democratic Party was split both on the left with Strom Thurmond and his Dixiecrats, and, on the right with Strom Thurmond and his Dixiecrats, and on the left with former Secretary of Agriculture Henry Wallace. But nevertheless, in an unprecedented coup, and perhaps because his Republican opponent was so weak in presenting himself, Truman managed to win. And now, talking from 1948, which is really when the modern political era begins, there was no third-party challenge in 1952, there was none in 56, there was none in 1960, there was none in 1964. The era of good feeling, so to speak, insofar as third-party challenges were concerned. There was, of course, George Wallace in 1968. And Nixon would have won with a much larger margin if Wallace had not entered the race. And Humphrey was starting to gain on Richard Nixon, and had that election been held 2 weeks later, there is a chance that Hubert Humphrey would have been the President of the United States. In 1972, there was a very minor third-party challenge from Representative Schmitz running as the head of George Wallace's American Party. He was marginal. He only took off 1 or 2%, and it didn't matter because Richard Nixon won with an astonishing plurality of the vote. In 1976, there wasn't really much of a third-party challenge. I think that, did Fred Harris run? I know he ran in the Democratic primaries, but did he actually run as a third-party candidate? I don't think he did. I don't remember this. Of course, in 1980, it was John Anderson. 1992 and 96, there was Ross Perot. But in 96, there was also Ralph Nader and the Natural Law Party, which probably prevented Clinton from getting 50 or 51% of the vote. He only got 49%. Bob Dole only got about 42%. Perot leached off about 9%, and the other two parties combined accounted for about 1% of the vote. So, Richard Nixon, let's talk about him a little bit. In 1972, he would say things like, well, what dirty things should I know about today? Or, $250,000 minimum. That was his price for an ambassadorship. Or, wouldn't it be better for the country to just check out? Agnew's just panting to get at it. Richard Nixon to Alexander Haig, May 1973, during the first breaking of the Watergate crisis. Just imagine if Agnew had become president. That could never been allowed to happen. I'd like to get Teddy Kennedy taped. There's something going on there, says Richard Nixon to Haldeman, April 1971. I am in charge, and I'm going to take the gloves off, get the story out, and kill him in the press. Richard M. Nixon on Daniel Ellsberg. Well, anyway, Bill Clinton has been called the luckiest politician since Miles Standish. One of the factors which worked into Bill Clinton's luck is having Richard Nixon, strangely enough, on his side. Richard Nixon probably gave him an awful lot of good advice. Nobody has ever said that Richard Nixon is stupid when it comes to politics. Perhaps when it comes to human relations, Richard Nixon is not quite as good a man as we might have wished for. However, insofar as politics is concerned, Nixon's the one. You know, of course, about that famous anecdote with the pregnant woman in the 1968 campaign rally holding up a big sign that says, Nixon's the one. One of those cute little double entendres that people who are ordinarily adverse to sexual innuendo find so delightful because it's so harmless, you know, and anyway, let's talk a little bit about Ross Perot's Reform Party and its factor in the election of 1996. Ron Bartel, who was a Reform Party breakaway faction leader, said, the Reform Party needs to look at Ross Perot's money like cocaine. They need to get off it as soon as possible. Will the Reform Party be a factor in the year 2000 election? If Ross Perot is the leader, the answer is no. Ross Perot got 19% of the vote in 1992. He got about 9% of the vote in 1996. We can reasonably expect him to get about 5% of the vote in the year 2000 if, in fact, he decides to run. In every case, Ross Perot was a vote that was basically thrown away. And whenever people realize that they're throwing their vote away on a hopeless third-party candidate, they begin to become less inclined to do so as the years roll by and reduce themselves to a hard core of individuals who either hold their nose at the prospect of voting for any of the major party candidates or who simply literally want to see the third party candidate win. So people aren't so much voting for Perot as against the two major candidates. Now, it was easier to vote against Clinton and Bush than it was to vote against Clinton and Dole. twice as many votes in 1992 as he did in 96. Now, how is the year 2000 election shaping up? 2 years ago, nobody would have guessed that someone like Jack Kemp even had a shot at the year 2000. But since his sudden prominence in the Republican Party, or let us say his reemergence into prominence into the Republican Party, that is no longer quite the case. So, the Republican frontrunner at the present time is probably Jack Kemp. Now, the truly hopeless Phil Gramm will also make another futile attempt, but will, as he did the last time, fail ignominiously. He is on the right wing, but the right wing is split into too many factions. William Bennett might be a good choice for a running mate, but whether he has the stature and gravitas to ascend to the presidential nomination, he's not even expressed an interest. Colin Powell could be the wild card, but the Colin Powell mania has sort of more or less run its course. And of course his wife is adamantly against him doing so, either as president or number two man. So what we're looking at is a field of Republican lightweights. No Republican of even the stature of Bob Dole. And I think the country would have been quite safe in Bob Dole's hands, and I think Bill Clinton felt the same way. Which didn't mean he was going to let Bob Dole win, but it also didn't mean he was willing to stoop to the type of mudslinging which would characterize Bill Clinton's reaction to a truly nefarious candidate. Now, Dan Quayle is probably going to run in the year 2000, but he simply cannot win. He wouldn't be able to win until the year 2008, if that. Look at Teddy Kennedy, 12 years after Chappaquiddick, and he still couldn't buy a break. And the same is true of Quayle. 12 years after the disastrous vice presidential nomination, at least as far as his aspirations were concerned, he still won't be able to buy a break. He's very popular among a certain faction of the Republican Party, but I would say that faction is no more than 1/3 of the party. And if 1/3 of the party unites and nominates Quayle, that means he will be eligible to win about 1/6 of the actual vote. If Dan Quayle runs for president, he will get about 32% of the popular vote, which is about as little as George McGovern got. Actually, George McGovern got 38% of the popular vote, if I recall rightly. The same amount of votes that George Bush got in 92. So, anyway, it's not going to be Quayle. So basically, what do you got? You got Kemp, Bennett, that guy Fred Thompson from Tennessee, who's trying to somehow parlay his acting experience and Watergate and Whitewater credentials into some sort of position of leadership. And you've got Lamar Alexander from Tennessee. Now, if it were a head-to-head face-up between Lamar Alexander and Al Gore, that would be like choosing between apples and more apples. I mean, the two are virtually indistinguishable. If it were between, say, Lamar Alexander and Richard Gephardt, I don't know. I'd probably have to vote for Lamar Alexander, but see, all these candidates have drawbacks. I'm not sure I would pick Gore, Gephardt, or Alexander to run the country. The problem is, who would you pick? Who else is there? Nobody has really made any sort of a splash in our national politics. Even Bill Clinton would have been considered at best a second-rate candidate had he chosen to run in 1984. Of course, he would have been far too young. And of course, he was very tempted to run in 1988, but what with people like Dukakis and Cuomo theoretically in the running, not to mention Gephardt and Gore, Bill Clinton didn't think it was going to be his magic year, nor did he feel like falling on his sword. Jackson. And, of course, we all know the results of that. So, you know that Dalmatians are dumb, need a lot of exercise, are snappish, destructive, aggressive, deaf, and their piss kills grass? Just a little sidelight. Has nothing to do with the discussion at hand, but I thought I'd throw it in. So, yeah, where was I? How? Oh, woof. So, did you know that Gorbachev got 1/2 of 1% of the 1996 vote during the Russian elections? Isn't that interesting how far somebody can fall? He got probably about the same number of votes as Ralph Nader got. Gorbachev and Nader, just imagine. Maybe Gorby should have run in this country, he probably would have done better. Okay, now, getting back to politics. Now I'm citing from The Nation. The Nation's getting awful popular here. I mean, Paul Newman is part owner of The Nation. He's even writing articles for him. This fact was deemed worthy of recognition in none other than the National Enquirer magazine. The National Enquirer really has expanded into some sort of prominence with its rival, the Canadian published Globe, snapping on its heels. See, the Globe gets the dirt, and the Enquirer kind of like rises above it, or attempts to. So, anyway, this is from The Nation of December 9th. It won't be long before we're actually into 1997. The Texaco flap with the racism. In other words, says Alexander Cockburn, ethics are not a problem. It's all a matter of poor public relations. Being racist pays. The trick is to be racist in an up-to-date, class-appropriate manner. Put on the tweed jacket and ironic mien of the endowed academic or brave commentator, and you'll do fine. And Benjamin DeMott refers to the phrase, the decline of civility, as a pet leader class phrase. This is what I like about The Nation. They actually tell it like it is, man. The incivility railed at by the elite should be seen as a protest by Americans outside the ranks of the publicly articulate against the conduct of their presumed betters. The current orthodoxy or volunteerism and immoderacy shuts its ears to this protest, simultaneously beatifying the undeserving and sapping democratic energy and will. Sold as diagnosis or nostrum, civility is in fact a theater of operations, the classless society's new class war zone. The new incivility needs to be recognized for what it is, a flat-out, justified rejection of leader class claims to respect. Now we know who is riding this new civility bandwagon all the way to the year 2000 nomination in the Republican Party. Why, it's none other than William Bennett, Ronald Reagan's Secretary of Education. If such a thing doesn't exist except in the world of oxymoron as Ronald Reagan's Secretary of Education. You know that Ronald Reagan wanted to abolish the Department of Education. And Daniel Quayle, the family values man. Dan Quayle tapped into the soccer mom zeitgeist 4 years before anybody else, at least. And, of course, you know, he was a prophet without honor in his own land. And even the Washington Post's rather suspect attempts to lend gravitas to the image of Dan Quayle were doomed to failure. Or, as Huck Finn put it, you can't pray a lie. So, you know, this is kind of odd. I will have an hour and a half left, but according to my calculations, I should have 2.5 hours left. I don't know what in hell is going on here, but I'm not sure I like it. So, anyway, let me say that about this. Let me say this about that. Let's see what's going on here, because I don't understand. Oh, never fear. Still have another half hour to go here. Well, anyway, even my dog, who loves me, is getting bored. So I'm going to like pick up the pace a little bit here. Yes, yes indeed, yes, yes. Maybe I can get through an entire notebook here. That would be nice. We could start on a new one. See, we've got about how many more notebooks to go? Let's see. 31, 32, 33, 34, 35, 37. Got about 1,000 more pages to go. So anyway, let's talk a little bit about the new civility. I am going to quote at length from Benjamin DeMott in The Nation from December 9th, 1996. The well-placed admire successful stonewalling, rate reputation for integrity above integrity, disbelieve that persons of modest means or inferior coiffure can attain distinction or escape shame. Rude, abusive speech and action reflects, as one of its dimensions, belief in the need for an attitude, some kind of protection against sly, sincerity-marking politicos and boss-class crooks. Uncivil refusal by ordinary citizens to labor unpaid in the cause of good works reflects the daily exposure of ordinary citizens to powerful anti-mutuality instruction from above. Oblique but persuasive lessons on how to pull your oar ceaselessly for the benefit of number one, how to avoid being suckered into caringness. Coupling intellectually and morally irresponsible oversimplifications with the kind of supercilious insult characteristic of oh-so Matthew Arnold thought barbarian aristos. The civility problem is one of bottom dog manners rather than top dog morals. Incivility is a response to an unendurable surfeit of corruption. Good. You see, this ties right into the title of last week's presentation, which was Hopelessly Corrupt. Of course, this week's presentation is called Radical Clarity, unless I'm badly mistaken. Faith that no talk on earth is more exalted than talk about talk. That is the new civility. When you're in an argument with a thug, there are things much more important than civility. Liberals want to tax me and send the money to a welfare mother whose son will mug my wife at the shopping mall. Mark Green citing Tom Wolfe, citing a Valley Stream, Long Island man. Conservatives are people who will take the money from my parents on Medicare and send it as tax breaks to polluters who downsize me out of work. The religious right is large enough to dominate the Republican Party, but too small to build a majority coalition around. And this all leads right back to Dan Quayle. The religious right, now no longer headed by Ralph Reed, incidentally, the religious right is large enough to dominate the Republican Party, but too small to build a majority coalition around. And that would seem to disqualify both William Bennett and Dan Quayle from becoming the leaders of the Republican Party. Moderate Democrats constitute 20% of the electorate, and conservative Republicans only constitute 21% of the Republican Party. And this is so complicated. Let's say half the people vote. And let's say further, oversimplify, half of them are Republicans, half of them are Democrats. conservative Republicans are 21% of the Republican Party. That means they're 11% of the electorate. That means that they alone cannot put a man in the White House. In case you were wondering. Now I'll quote from New Statesman of the 15th of November. People wonder why the citizenry is cynical. After all, the whole point of democracy is not to have bipartisan government. I'm not quite sure I understand Alexander Cockburn's reasoning. However, he does make a very salient point, one which I've been sort of searching my memory banks to figure out. Of course, it's been said many times, many ways, but it can't hurt to say it again. The state never gives back freedoms it took away. It never says, sorry, we goofed. Turns out it was all our fault. Something that is very worth remembering. The state never gives back freedoms it took away. And of course, there's a corollary. Once the state gives freedoms, it is very, very difficult to take them away, as the Russian Revolution proves. Well, Chumley, let's go see Professor Whoopi, the smartest man in the world. Ugh. George Wallace, cited in the book Dixie Rising by Peter Applebaum, a book which, incidentally, I had almost forgotten I had read. William J. Kilpatrick is cited as saying about George Wallace, Wallace could strut sitting down. He was full of nervous stage business, standing up, sitting down, the horn-rimmed glasses on, the glasses off, lighting his cigar, licking the cigar, spitting in the wastebasket. Senator Hugh Scott said of George Wallace, he's a menace to the Democratic and Republican parties. I think if he bit himself, he would die of blood poisoning. Well, as long as we're talking about the influence of the South, let's talk a little bit about the history of the domination of the South in American politics. Well, we may remember from our American history that prior to the Civil War, the South managed to put a gag rule on the Congress in which the topic of slavery would not be discussed in those August chambers. It is the South's dominance of our national politics prior to the Civil War which led to the factional splits in the two-party system, which eventually led to the Civil War. The South was a vanquished province for many years after the Civil War. The South's reemergence probably came about in about the year 1896 with Plessy versus Ferguson and a spate of lynchings which pretty much dominated the next 40 to 50 years in the South. There were a great many lynchings between 1896 and 1940, as documented in Ginsburg's book, 100 Years of Lynchings. George Wallace has been quoted as saying, the South is no longer geography. It's an attitude and a philosophy towards government. As a matter of fact, the South can almost fairly be said to dominate American politics. The power of the Republican South gives Southerners and Southern interests an ability to shape public perceptions and national politics to a degree they have not since the Civil War. Tennessee Rising by Peter Applebone. But as long as we're discussing the South, before we leave the scenic South for good, let's talk a little bit about the primary figure in the South, Elvis. There are eerie parallels between the Lord and the King, beginning with their birth to sainted women and ending with their death, resurrection, and adoration. Both were Capricorns. Well, that's, of course, disputable. Jesus was a carpenter. Elvis's favorite high school class was woodshop. Jesus said, "Love thy neighbor," Matthew 22:39. Elvis said, "Don't be cruel," RCA 1956. Jesus walked on water. Elvis surfed. Mary had an immaculate conception. Priscilla Presley went to Immaculate Conception High School. Jesus' countenance was like lightning, and his raiment white as snow. Elvis wore snow-white jumpsuits with lightning bolts. Need I say more? Anyway, back to politics. Time magazine from December 2nd, 1996. Campaign funds are given to politicians and political parties to influence votes and get favors. Duh. So, if the Poles who got the funds didn't vote the way the donor wants, aren't they taking money under false pretenses? Says Stuart M. Lee. I don't understand why the millions of dollars used for campaigning can't be used to end hunger and disease or to save the environment, says Jennifer A. Simon on page 15 of Time magazine from December 2nd, 1996. Well, Bob Dornan to Representative William Doherty, who supported his opponent in the election. Bob Dornan said, "You are a slimy coward. Go register in another party." Bob Dornan, well, couldn't have happened to a nicer guy, huh? Anyway, in the New York Review of Books for the 28th of November, S.G. Payne, citing Robert A. Paxton in Stages of Fascism, says, "Radical movements are parties that cut across classes and which rule as parts of fascist governance." Fascism is a political practice intended by its leaders to serve quite specific functions: to unite, purify, and energize nations or ethnic groups that have been put under strain by internal divisions, by the fear of decadence, or by tumultuous social changes. Sounds an awful lot like the Reagan administration, but let's not go there. World War I made fascism possible. Large numbers of disgruntled veterans, a middle class losing its status through runaway inflation, threatened by a socialist revolution, violence glamorized, and the nation glorified by wartime propaganda. Yes, that sounds an awful lot like the 1980s, actually. Hitler and Mussolini learned how to make fascism successful by trial and error. Psychological rather than material rewards of fascism, namely, a satisfying sense of national destiny and belonging. The early followers who wanted genuine change in the social hierarchy and the distribution of wealth had to be written off. Fascism is anti-bourgeois, anti-left nationalism. Conservatives who are fearful of revolution. Fascism is the tumultuous expansion of mass participation in politics in newly created democracies where traditional forms of social control based on deference no longer worked, fascism is a reaction to that. Fascism is also a reaction to economic globalization that exposed worker producers to worldwide competition and tempted them to try authoritarian and autarkic forms of market regulation. In a nutshell, in every case we know of, fascists have arrived at power by inside deals, by arrangement with forces clearly in power or close to it. Fascist leaders have had to govern in collaboration with the existing elites who brought them into office, while also trying not to alienate the members of the party who had made them powerful enough to attract the elite's attention in the first place. More on fascism. A four-way struggle for dominance within fascist regimes among the leader, his party, whose militants clamor for more jobs, perquisites, power, and expansionist adventures, the regular state functionaries ranging from police commanders to magistrates, and the traditional elites, particularly the army and big business. Ernst Frankl described the fascist dual state, in which conventional agencies coexisted with parallel party organizations. Now, folks, this is such a fascinating article, I'm going to have to repeat that citation. The New York Review of Books, November 28, 1996. Fascism. Claiming to transcend political factions, fascist leaders shifted their people's attention to martial prowess and communal pageantry, what Walter Benjamin called fascism's aestheticization of politics. Now, no one's trying to say that Ronald Reagan was a fascist, but there is that certain aestheticization of politics which took place under his regime. And why is it that whenever one refers to a regime, it's always a fascist regime, as in God Save the Queen, the fascist regime? Authoritarian regimes govern through existing elites rather than through a single mass party. They prefer passive citizens to mobilized ones. And this all, of course, ties in with what I mean by radical clarity. But truly, radical clarity signifies a movement in journalism in which nothing is left unexplained. In other words, the assumption that the reader has no education and no knowledge of any history, even contemporary history, that hasn't taken place in the last 3 months. Well, let's talk a little bit about the New Republic and something that Michael Kelly said about racially charged speech. Now, we all know that a traditional methodology of fascism is to create a scapegoat, usually a scapegoat race. Sometimes, however, it is a scapegoat class of individuals, like, let's say, people with big hair or people who have bad manners. Or, for that matter, people who have different types of hair, different skin color, different types of cultures, and accordingly, different manners. Now, just last night on NYPD Blue or Law and Order or wherever it was, someone was quoted as saying, "When's the last time you saw a white taxi cab driver?" Anyway, let's talk a little bit about Michael Kelly, who says in the New Republic, "With accusations of racially charged speech, the terrible charge is leveled. The accused attempts feebly to defend himself. He says he never did what is alleged, or that he was trying to make a joke, or that he didn't mean it, or that his words were taken out of context, or that it is unfair to destroy a person's life over a single utterance. The guardians of these things demand severe punishment. Generally, the sinner is banished from decent society, although sometimes he is allowed to remain in a limited role following re-education, traditionally in the form of a special episode of Nightline, and expiation, again traditionally with Larry King. Also, generally, at a certain point in the proceedings, Jesse Jackson and Al Sharpton and Kwesi Mufumi appear and demand large amounts of cash and or jobs from whatever white institution has the misfortune to be associated with the miscreant. The institution ponies up, announces it is hiring a diversity consultant, and grovels. Well, the only thing you could say to something like that is that it sort of constitutes the revenge of the overdog. Why the nerve of these people demanding racial justice? What makes them think that their pleas for racial justice should take precedence over, say, pleas for economic justice? Well, you can't have one without the other. Now, I didn't jot this little phrase down because I totally disagree with it. However, I find it rather odd that somebody is writing so passionately in defense of Texaco or in defense of racists in general. Yes. Well, we should have known that Bill Clinton would have been the traditional Democrat if we were aware of the saying, I've never met a governor who doesn't like federal spending. Representative E. Clay Shaw, also quoted in the New Republic of December 9th. Well, it's getting later and later. In the last several years, the American right has come to ape the attitude of the American left towards Russia. Asia is the conservatives' future that works. Conservatives hail Singapore as a model of economic and social progress, a new type of democracy, superior to the American variety. And yet, how is Singapore ruled? By fascism. Kishore Mahbubani, permanent secretary of Singapore's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, argues that democracy is an impediment to rapid economic justice. For American businessmen, appeasement is nirvana. They have always relished working with dictatorships that guarantee stability, and foreign policy big shots like Kissinger give them the intellectual cover that they need. Now let us quote from Harper's Magazine of December 1996. Bork follows the medieval practice of identifying God's enemies by category instead of name: radical feminists, activist homosexuals, multiculturalists, black extremists. Quoting from Lewis Lapham. By the way, Lewis Lapham's essays in Harper's Magazine are always very instructive, I have found to be the case. Now, in the New Yorker of December 12th, it is said of Eva Peron, the poor identified with her rage and fed it in turn with their love. Alma Guillermo-Prieto also says, fanaticism turns life into a permanent and heroic process of dying, but it is the only way that life can defeat death. So, now that we've had our little chat about fascism, let's move on a little bit. In the Spectator of the 16th of November, John O'Sullivan is quoted as saying, floundering was the only activity the Dole campaign managed with any consistency. And I suppose indeed that was the case. So as we wind down, let me say that about this. Al Gore has been referred to in the journal In These Times of December 25th, 1996 as the Teflon Vice President. And indeed, we're not going to get the real poop on Al Gore for quite some time, it seems. In the New York Times book review of November 17th, it has been said that frontier insurgency, racial intolerance, and agricultural revolt has been a part of our politics and culture since well before the revolution. So, we're talking the new fascism. According to Nelson Lichtenstein, isolation, gun fetishism, and hypermasculinity exacerbated by the economic insecurity endemic to agricultural life leads, of course, to the predictable characteristics. So let's talk a little bit about tabloid journalism, cited from the same journal. Tabloid journalism today vivifies a world of villains and victims, of guilt and innocence. It presumes to know what is right and good, which makes it easy to expose what's wrong and bad. By playing the role of guardian of the moral order, they assume a moral consensus without having to define or defend it. Violations of the moral order are dealt with factually rather than morally. Debate and discussion weren't necessary. The story simply spoke for itself, according to Theodore M. Glasser. Quote then from the New York Times book review of November 24th, and we will pretty much be done with November, more or less, it is to be hoped. Hillary Rodham Clinton would seem to have the most in common with Eva Peron, both for the Gothic hatred she inspires in her detractors and the accusations of the same overreaching, unseemly ambition. Rosa Lee casts doubt on society's ability to ameliorate poverty by trying to micromanage behavior. A true war against poverty would take aim at the structures and processes that produce excesses of wealth along with excesses of privation, says Theodore Rosegarden. Now here's an interesting quote from Len Garment about Pat Buchanan, speechwriter of President Nixon. He was pounding the typewriter like the keys were 50 Jane Fondas. Isn't that charming? The hatred that exists. The hatred that exists in this country. Well, after the election, of course, the coverage of political events predictably falls off. In the aftermath of the election, there is a period of time in which learned journals pretty much devote their energies to post-mortems. That was less the case in this election because folks pretty much knew what the outcome was going to be. So, if I may, I would like to digress a little bit and talk about 1963. It seems that every generation has what they call the last good year. In the case of the baby boomers, I would have to say, being a constituent member of that cohort and smack dab in the middle of it, to boot, 1963 was the last good year. I remember well when President Kennedy was assassinated. I was only 6 years old, going on 7. But I remember staying home from school that day, for whatever reason. I would be absent from school from time to time. And watching television only to learn that the president had been shot. Now, this is difficult to talk about because I remember other less than desirable aspects of 1961, 62, 63. The air raid drills, lining up in the hallway, cowering on the floor with our hands covering our heads. But having gone to a Catholic school, I remember most of all the incredible unhappiness of all the nuns when it was learned that the president had been assassinated. Things were never quite right again following that weekend. The weekend of national mourning, unprecedented in our history perhaps since the assassination of Lincoln. And if I could just say one thing about the assassination of President Kennedy, it would be this, that not only was a man struck down, but it was also the assassination of all of our hopes for a better society, even though we couldn't possibly realize it at the time. And the man who did this thing had a Manichaean viewpoint, one in which good is good and evil is evil, and there are no shades of gray. John F. Kennedy was not beyond criticism in his stewardship of the United States, but he certainly didn't deserve to be struck down in his prime. And I don't think I could possibly add anything to this particular portion of our presentation which would in any way fail to detract from what I've already said, except that truly the assassination of John F. Kennedy was a result of a fascist mentality, a radical clarity towards great events. I would like to ask you to tune in next week to Cafe Cabaret when we'll be continuing our series on politics with a program entitled Insider Out. This is all for now. I suppose we're going to end the show early. Might be a good thing to do. All things considered. Cafe Cabaret is broadcast every Tuesday night on Channel 55, Cambridge Community Television. I'm sorry for the absence of a logo, but I've been having problems with this video recorder, as I've probably expressed many times before, and somehow it just doesn't seem worth the effort to buy a new one at this time, at this late hour. So, I haven't. So please tune in next week when we will have a more festive discussion of politics. We will be discussing post-election issues in the ensuing weeks. And so let us say that this was part 8 of our long-running series, and that the remainder of the series will probably be about 16 weeks in duration. So that will cover July, August, September, and October. That will bring us right up to November of 1997, at which point we will probably take a break from politics and deal more with parlor tricks instead. So let us never negotiate out of fear, but let us never fear to negotiate. whatever the hell that means. You have been tuned to Cafe Cabaret. Our next program will be on July 1st. I'm writing down all this information. Good night.